As you know, we've been talking a lot in recent weeks about the need for clear and articulate progressive media to cut through the noise and the static with some clear signals out there. Here to talk about that with us now is Michele Jawando. Michele is an attorney. She's a social justice advocate. She is currently vice president for legal progress at the Center for American Progress. And before that, she was general counsel and an advisor to Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. She also has a podcast coming up that she will talk to us about. In fact, it's already started. So first of all, Michele Jawando, thanks for coming on the Zero Hour.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with this. Before we get into the sort of big picture ideas, you have a new podcast with Igor Volsky, who's one of the writers over there, right?
We sure do, and it's super exciting. The name of our podcast is Thinking Cap, and it is a little play on words, but it is also kind of a call to action in a time where critical thinking is not always happening. How do we lift up voices of the resistance, those who are engaged in this work? What are the values that drive us to do this? What are our stories and histories? Igor and I both have immigrant roots, and so kind of telling our own personal story of how we got into this work and why we agitate and do the kind of policy or campaigns or direct action is actually a major part of the American story, and one that we don't always talk enough about. And so our goal with Thinking Cap is to both lift up these issues, lift up those various voices in this movement, and really chart a way forward, particularly at this moment.
I can really relate to what you said, Michele, because 3 of my 4 grandparents were immigrants. And I think, so were both of Donald Trump's parents, but some of us remember and some of us don't, I guess. I guess I would like to pivot from that to the fact that we're hearing so much crazy talk nowadays, and trying to get beams of sanity we can focus on now seems to be such a challenge all around. You're an attorney. Attorneys are trained are supposed to be trained in critical thinking. I can name a couple who aren't so good at it, but it is supposed to be part of the job. And you've been in public policy where, again, we're supposed to think critically. So what's your take on the whole fake news phenomenon, or whatever you want to call it, the crazy stuff that gets said nowadays on the air and on Twitter by the president, or wherever else you're going to find this stuff?
Well, I think it's so disappointing because it makes the act of democracy more dishonest. Right. And I say that because when we don't have the right information going into debates, or actually the facts that bolster either side, whether or not you have a different ideological bent on attacking a problem, that's fine. But if you're not even going into that argument with the right facts, then we are woefully not prepared for the challenges that face us. I think about the fact that we are now in Washington, D.C., talking about the U.S. pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords, the Paris Climate Agreement. And what many people are unaware of is that the climate agreement is voluntary. It is a set of standards that each individual country comes to on their own and says, we recognize as a global community, each country, each nation wants to do something. And so if we don't want to do as much as Barack Obama did, Trump administration, fine. But pulling out wholesale just puts us in a category with Syria and Nicaragua, who kind of had their head in the sand. But every other country, including the other major polluters, which the U.S. is one of the chief polluters worldwide, but you have other countries like Russia, like China, who are saying, you know what, I'm going to do something. And so to abdicate that leadership and then to make such a dishonest argument to the the American people, as if the U.S. couldn't just modify their role as opposed to pull out of this voluntary agreement. So what's one of the things that we talked about on Thinking Cap, putting what the facts really are out there, and then just letting the American people know that there is a role and a space for you to play in this resistance work. You know, we're talking a lot about Donald Trump and his role in this, but 21 senators, including Mitch McConnell, signed on to a letter and told him to do such, to pull out of the accord. So really making sure that people have the facts, the information, so that they are empowered to do something.
Yeah, and just to jump in for a second, I agree with everything you said. I should also remind our listeners that we are recording on Thursday afternoon. We don't know yet officially whether Donald Trump will in fact announce later today that we are pulling out of the Paris Accords, but even the conversation around it, I think you make a great point by reminding us that it's voluntary, that even the discussion about pulling out of the Paris Accords in its own way is a form of deception. It's a form of fake news because it's first of all, because the media haven't reminded people either that it's a voluntary accord. And secondly, because it's a way for the president to kind of drive the news cycle with this false notion that maybe climate change isn't real. It's another way to say, it's another way for him to proclaim, there's no such thing as climate change, even though the overwhelming majority of scientists agree on it. There's no way in which any objective reading of the facts says that climate change isn't a thing. It's a thing. It's a thing that's endangering the entire planet, that could make 100 million people refugees, that could poison the air and water for our children, and make the planet too warm to be livable. And yet somehow our news media and our public discourse is not focused on the fact that this is something that's real, and that having a president and a Republican majority that denies its existence is literally potential catastrophe for hundreds of millions of people. Am I overstating the case?
No, without question. I mean, I think what has happened is we've pretended like there are two sides to every story. And the fact is, if you ask people who were affected by Hurricane Sandy, I'm from New York, born and raised. I remember, and Inconvenient Truth is number 2 is coming out shortly, but there's a scene in the trailer that from Inconvenient Truth 1 where they talked about how New York would be underwater. Mm-hmm. And then they showed this caption of Hurricane Sandy and how areas around the 9/11 memorial were flooded after that great storm. And that was something that Al Gore talked about 10 years prior. Climate change is no longer something to be debated. And so the fact that we have elected officials, the news media, perpetuating that there's any other reason or rationale other than knowing that climate change is real is preposterous. And there's really no reason that those arguments should be lifted up. And that's why I'm excited about Thinking Cap and the work that we're able to do and bringing that information. I mean, outlets like We Act Radio being able to bring information to listeners so that they can make critical decisions about where they get information and how they can be moved to action and things that they can do is so incredibly important right now. And that is really our role as citizens in this democracy, for us to find out information and then to figure out how to act on that information. And that action can be voting, or that action can be talking to our elected officials or participating in a protest. But this is a moment where we are really called to do that because of the grave consequences of inaction.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned Inconvenient Truth and what happened in the horrible stuff that happened around Hurricane Sandy being a verification of it. I just want to add to that, we actually had saltwater damage in the subways of Lower Manhattan, which is such a sort of doomsday scenario, we would have thought, 20 years before. This thing is real. This thing is happening all around us. And we do need these new media to talk about this sort of thing. Besides the environment, what kind of stories are you guys covering?
So, I'm really excited. Our latest episode had Melissa Harris Perry. Many people are familiar with Melissa from her show she had on MSNBC for 4 years, as well as kind of her work as a noted professor and author, and really talking about the role of Black women in the resistance movement, how we either don't both appreciate, acknowledge, and recognize that Donald Trump in many ways is just a representation of some of the worst parts of America. And so he's not something that hasn't been with us. He really is he is as American as apple pie. And although he may offend so many of our sensibilities, it's important to contextualize kind of who he is and what he represents in this moment, but also how history shows us that there are ways to overcome and get past this moment, because we've done it before. And particularly when you look at the histories of African Americans in this country and Black women and our role in the resistance movement, that should give you some indication that there is a path forward. And we talked about things like the media and the consolidation of media and what that really means and how we cover these issues. So it's really exciting. We had Cory Booker on, Jason Kander, talking about voting, leaders from Move On and Daily Action and ACLU. So we're excited. We're just beginning. We think it's something unique that isn't in the space of how we lift up different voices of the resistance and what that really means for so many people.
Well, where can people go, and how can people find out more about what you guys are doing?
So you can definitely check us out any place where you get your podcast, whether that's on iTunes or Stitcher, SoundCloud, or Google Play. We have a live episode up every Thursday, and you may find bonus episodes from time to time. But we're really excited because we think that this is a moment to take a deep dive into these issues. We try to focus on one thing each week, but really bring the voices and the values of the resistance movement, of the work that pushes us as progressives to think about how we interact with this moment, and ways for you as citizens to get engaged in our democracy. And this is the moment and the time to do so.
Well, I don't know about you, Michele, but as much as I've been traumatized, like everybody, by the election of Donald Trump, I'm optimistic about the energy that people are bringing to the desire for change and to the movement for change. And I think that voices like yours will help that. So I hope people will check out your podcast, Michele Jawando of the Center for American Progress. And of course, if you want to support us, we're at www.patreon.com/thezerohour. But Michele Jawando, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks so much. Always great to be here with you, and thanks for the great work you do.
Likewise.